Welcome all to Breaking into the Boys Club, Gender and Youth in the Boardroom. I'm Julia Wesa. I'm the executive director of the Boarding School, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to supporting, placing, and educating young people on boards of directors, working to break down the barriers that keep young people out of institutional governance. So to give a little bit of background on the boarding school, this event, how it all fits together, our work isn't specific to any one industry, but it started with a project called Harvard Forward, which brought together Harvard alumni, students, staff, and faculty to place 3 young alums on Harvard's Board of Overseers with a platform that called for the university to divest from fossil fuels, double down on climate-focused research and education, and reserve 6 out of its 30 boards of overseers seats for recent alums that have graduated within the past 5 years. Since then, Harvard Forward's sister campaign, Yale Forward, placed a young climate policy expert on the Yale Corporation's 2021 ballot with a similar climate action platform. And just this week, Harvard Forward's newest 3 candidates, Megan Redshirt Shaw, Natalie Unterstel, and Dr. Yvette Efebera, all 3 women, finished their election campaign for the Harvard Board of Overseers on a platform centered around climate and racial justice, socially responsible investing, and inclusive governance. In the context of empowering the US's most diverse generations yet for these sorts of roles on boards, we're seeking to understand how young people with marginalized identities navigate traditional boardrooms, sorts of old boys clubs, as you all may have noticed in the title of this event. As you know, the topic of this conversation centered around how young board members with minoritized gender identities have experienced and contributed to male-dominated boardrooms, and it's driven by a yet persistent gender gap in higher education trustees, of whom only about 30% are women and an understudied, presumably much smaller percentage are trans and gender non-binary. Because gender and youth interact in unique and often unhelpful ways, we're excited to talk to our 2 panelists, Cinthia Flores and Senator Sarah Elfreth, today about how they have experienced their individual roles on the University system of Maryland and University of California boards of regents. With that, I will talk through a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We'll be recording this event and sharing a blog post that you all are welcome to share with anyone who wasn't able to attend today. And we'll have ample time at the end for audience members to interact with our hosts, ask questions, join the discussion. So please drop your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. So with that, I will pass it off to our rockstar educational programs team member, Jasmine, to introduce our panelists more in detail, and we can get the conversation going.
Yeah, hi everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Jasmine. I'm currently on a gap year from being a student at Princeton University and working as an educational programs intern for the boarding school for the spring. I'm really excited to introduce our 2 hosts for today, Sarah Elfreth and Cinthia Flores. So Senator Sarah Elfreth uses she, her pronouns, and she was the University System of Maryland student regent from 2009 to 2010, as well as being the author of The Young Guardians, Students as Stewards of the Past, Present, and Future of American Higher Education. Elected in 2018 to represent Annapolis and Southern Arundel County, Senator Sarah Elfreth is the youngest woman ever elected to the Maryland State Senate. She is passionately committed to serving her constituents, both in the State House and in the community. In her first 2 legislative sessions, Sarah worked with colleagues across the aisle to pass 20 bills she sponsored on issues ranging from supporting the city of Annapolis, libraries and small businesses, addressing the backlog of untested rape kits, and protecting oysters and clean water. Sarah serves on the Budget and Taxation Committee as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Critical Area, and as one of 2 senators representing Maryland on the Multi-State Chesapeake Bay Commission. Cinthia Flores uses she, her, and aya pronouns and was the University of California student regent from 2012 to 2014. Cinthia Flores is a board member of the California Agricultural Labor Relations Board. She was previously a staff attorney with the Coalition for Humane Immigration, where she practiced immigration law with a focus on removal defense. Currently, Cinthia serves on the board for Latinas Lead California Political Action Committee, an organization dedicated to electing Latinas to local, state, and federal office. Cinthia also serves on the Latinas Lawyers Bar Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting Latinas in the legal profession. Cinthia is a graduate of the University of California, Irvine School of Law. During law school, Cinthia served as a regent on the University of California Board of Regents. She is a graduate of UCLA, and while at UCLA, she served as the first Latina student body president. So with that, now that you all have some more context and background on our two hosts for today, I'll give it back to Julia to start us off with the conversation.
Thanks, Jasmine. Super impressive bios. And to start off our conversation, I think it's always helpful to know a little bit about the context of the different boards that our panelists are coming from, because board structures and processes can fluctuate so much between even public university boards across the country. And so, with both of our panelists, starting with Cinthia, I wonder if you could walk us through what your respective boards were like when you got there. What were their demographic makeups and appointment processes? Were there any issues on their campuses related to gender equity at the time?
Wonderful. Well, first, thank you for having me and for doing the work that you do. It's incredibly important work. And I think that the intersection of being a woman and then a young person, that intersection is really hard to navigate. As it is, governance is a difficult task for folks, but governance in a system and a structure that doesn't necessarily affirm or welcome your participation makes it that much more difficult. So thank you for that. So the UC Board of Regents is a board comprised of appointed board members that oversees the entire UC system. So the UC system is comprised of 10 campuses, but there are also medical centers, a couple of research centers, et cetera. At the time of my appointment, the board was primarily comprised of governor appointed members, but there's also ex officio members. And there are also members like myself that essentially, had a different path to the board that weren't semi-appointed. So there was like an interview process and then a final appointment by the board itself. And it was primarily made up of men. However, there were some really outstanding women on the board that made their presence known. Women that I still look up to, still keep in contact with. And that really kind of eased a transition for me to be on the board. In fact, when I served as student regent, the board chair was a woman. And so that was an interesting time because the board chair was a woman. At the time, the board was also voting in a new UC president, which was Secretary Janet Napolitano. And she served as the first woman president for the UC system. And then, so there was a kind of a shift, I think, in making sure that there was more inclusion and representation on the board. So again, my position was not necessarily an appointed position. It was a position that I interviewed for with student leaders, and then kind of went through an interview process, and then was finally referred to a special committee of the board, and the board finalized my appointment, essentially.
That's great background. And in particular, the comment that you made about sort of what leadership looks like when you're coming into these roles is a really interesting topic that I hope we'll get into later in the conversation. But I think, having someone who's serving as someone who's a woman serving as the chair or the president of the university when you're coming into this role is a really interesting piece that we might get into. Senator Elfreth, I would ask you the same question. Could you give us a little bit of background on what your board looked like when you got there, what the demographic makeup was like, its appointment processes, any sort of issues related to gender equity at the time that were top of mind or otherwise?
Yeah, so I served 2009 to 2010. We had 1-year terms for the student member at the time. And at the time, the board was 18 people, all but the student, well, actually everybody was appointed by the governor. We had one ex officio member was our Secretary of Agriculture, because we had some land grant institutions, which is kind of a throwback to the land grants. I say was because one of the first bills I worked on when I came to the Maryland Senate was a complete top-down reform of the Board of Regents. And so we expanded the board, we added the Commerce Secretary, because I think we can all agree there's a direct connection between our university system and, looking at workforce development and the future of the economy. And then we actually modeled our reform for the student member off of the UC system, because I got to work with some great folks in the UC system where they have a 2-year term for the student members, 1 year kind of non-voting, really getting their footing, and then the next year voting and training the next one down. So we actually copied that in our legislation. So as of today, we have an expanded board and two student members, 1 voting, 1 non-voting, and they have a little bit more time to get their feet underneath them. But when I was on the board in 2009, 18-member board, I was one of 3 women. And then of the board at the time, I would say maybe 3 people of color on our board, and Maryland is a pretty diverse state. So not particularly representative of the state as a whole. But I was appointed, similar interview process, kind of every university has their own internal system. The university system of Maryland's 12 institutions. So each institution has the ability to put up 1 student nomination. Not everybody does, and they each have their own system of deciding who. That goes on to an interview with the chancellor, which is what we call the president. It's a reverse, it depends on the type of system we're talking about, but our chancellor, and then an interview with the governor's appointment secretary, and then the governor makes the selection. So I was really fortunate to be went through that 3-month interview process and was fortunate to be appointed. And I had about 6 months before I was sworn in. And I think that's a really important thing during my time when I only had 1 year, utilizing that training period and really diving deeply into the issues before I had the ability to take a vote. So when I did take a vote, I was much more informed than I otherwise would have been. So that's kind of the university system back then of Maryland, and we've made some changes, including also taking that orientation piece in the law that we passed. The bill that I had, we actually mandated orientation before they were sworn in, because I think it's really important when we're talking about a multi-institution system. It's a lot to learn, a lot of presidents to learn, institutions, demographics. Each institution within a system is unique, and for members of boards, regardless of whether they're a student or a full-blown member, there's a lot to learn before you should take a vote. And so we mandated that orientation. So yeah, that's the university system in a nutshell. I was a full voting member. A lot of public institutions ensure full voting rights for student members, which I think is a great thing as well. And some incredible experience. I'm actually having breakfast with 2 former board members tomorrow morning. So we stay in touch.
Amazing. That's great to hear, and speaks to sort of how these connections can be so intertwined while you're in the role and afterwards. Next up, I have sort of a loaded question, but it's what this whole conversation is about, and hopefully will lead to more later on. But both of you spoke about sort of the unique structures of your board that had sort of underlying questions around gender. Senator Elfreth, the fact that there were only 3 women on a board of 18 while you were serving, and Cinthia, while you were serving, the chair and president or the chancellor of the university system were women. And just to start off our conversation, I'm curious if both of you could speak a little bit about how your gender identity, or that of others you observed on the board, might have felt salient in the boardroom, if at all, and give us some examples of times where you sort of saw it become salient in the boardroom in either positive or negative ways, and we can lead our conversation from there. Senator Elfreth, do you want to start us off?
I think you asked me to start because I shared a particular incident with you the last time we talked, but for the most part, from the perspective of my fellow board members, I was treated as a full-blown equal member of the board. And I think because we had this rich history in Maryland, dating back to the 70s, of having a student member who was a voting member. And so I benefited from a long track record of very talented, bright, engaged student members. So I walked in with kind of a confidence already from my fellow board members. There were occasions, I think, where maybe university presidents didn't always take me as seriously as they would have had I been a not student member. But yes, there's one incident that we still talk about at the State House. Actually, we were one of the chief functions of a board, particularly boards of systems is to hire and fire university presidents. I think it's one of the most important decisions we can make. So I was fortunate enough to sit through 2 of those in my tenure. I won't name the institution or the president, but sitting through one of those interviews, one of the candidates made a very inappropriate remark to me in the middle of his job interview in front of the rest of the board. I was so fortunate that my board members had my back and we were able to kind of move beyond it. But that person wasn't our top choice to begin with, but certainly his comment, again, in a job interview to the young woman in the room, and I think I was only one of 2 women in that particular room at that moment. It obviously did not sit well with my fellow board members, and we decided not to hire him as a university president. He went on to be a president of another university. I hope he did not sexually harass a young woman in the room during his job interview for that. But it was a jarring moment. But I was, I tell the story because I was the shining light out of it was that I had supported board members who recognized how inappropriate that moment was and did not reward that behavior with the job.
Certainly appreciate you sharing that, and I think is a important sort of example to share. And I'm curious, to hear more and talk more about others that folks might be interested in hearing about if they're considering looking into these positions. Cinthia, do you want to talk about the same question, essentially, how you saw gender identity affect the way that yourself or others in the boardroom contributed to the work that you were doing?
Yeah, and I want to say to the senator, thank you so much for sharing that story, because I know that women in particular, when we are in these roles, we have a tendency to have to overcompensate for our gender, right? Or for what people perceive to be a need to overcompensate for our gender. And it's not, it's not great to go into that knowing that that's an expectation and then have it like affirmative, like experience where you're remembered, right? Like, oh, right, this is why I feel like I have to overcompensate for at every time. And so what I mean by that is, I believe that gender is an important factor to consider in any room. Boardroom, schoolroom, like governance room, bathroom, whatever, right? Like we need to have that identity be considered because we live in a society that's a patriarchal society. And so as for me, my identity as a woman of color also provided me with a perspective which I evaluate and consider. And so there were many times, I think I had a very similar experience with the senator where my colleagues, for the most part, saw me as an equal, respected my vote, respected my opinion. But there was an element of having to prove myself. And that's how I felt like my gender kind of identity felt salient, because there was always this idea of, well, you're young, you're also a woman, you have to be more prepared. You have to be very critical about when, how, in what way you use your voice, and not be typecast as, oh, well, you care about those issues because you're a woman of color or a student of color or you're a student, right? And so having to qualify and validate my perspective, opinion, and my decisions in a way where I was having to do double the work, right? So I had to be prepared on the nuts and bolts of things, but also had to be prepared for any element of undermining, questioning, etc., because they're like, oh, well, you're a young woman, of course you would feel that way or take that position, etc. And so there was definitely some of that going on for sure.
Definitely. And, I think that speaks a lot to what it felt like you had to do in essence to feel heard. And I think that that's a great place to take our conversation next, is just what strategies each of you felt to be effective to feel heard. I know, Cinthia, you just talked about just being almost over prepared for the role in ways that many other people just didn't have to be. And I'm curious if you could talk more about what what that meant in practice. I'm sure many young people who might be referencing this talk in the future might be interested in sort of picking up little snippets that they can use to feel confident when they're coming into these roles, particularly from a minoritized gender identity. And I'd love to know sort of what you found to be useful.
Definitely. I would say use the resources that are made available to you, right? So if you're thinking about going onto a board of this nature, if you have to go through a several interview process, familiarize yourself with the institutions that are part of the stakeholders, right, in the process. So for me, it was the UC Council of Presidents and the University of California Student Association. Familiarize yourself with their issues, right? Their scope of work, what their leaders have been working on, what are their priorities. Align yourself with, okay, if these are their priorities, are these also my priorities? And how can we work together collaboratively? I also would say, it's really important to understand your role, right? And this is kind of nerdy, but if there are bylaws that create your role, right? Like what do the bylaws say about your role? And then again, have an internal evaluation. Is this something that I feel I want to do? And how am I going to enable myself, empower myself to do it well? And also, I think figuring out how to be effective on a board also depends on figuring out the culture of the board, right? And so to the extent that you can lean on others, folks that have had your experience prior, or your position prior to you, putting in that work beforehand to sit with folks, talk to them one-on-one, figure out, okay, what works, what doesn't work. Also, figuring out just kind of the flow of the board. Is this a board that prioritizes consensus? Is this a board that wants for you, if you have an issue, to come to folks prior to it being on the agenda item to be voted on, so that you can maybe have your edits in place so that you can get to a consensus at at voting time. And also knowing when to use your platform, right? This is a public, well, at least for us, it is a public position. And so when is it appropriate, of course, based on what the ethics, rules, regulations, et cetera, but when is it appropriate to bring in the public in a public forum on these matters and issues? And so those are kind of things that I would think about.
Cinthia, those are all really great ideas. And I think my best advice on top of that is to not be shy, have the confidence to walk in day one that you are a co-equal member of this board. And really, I think it's harder for young people. It's certainly hard for me. A lot of those board members are very wealthy people, established people, and very, presidents and CEOs. And for me, I walked in, I was a scholarship student. My stepdad drove trains. My mother was a probation officer. And I was not raised with the skill set of, taking people to lunch to get to know them, or knowing parliamentary procedure, anything like that. So I really had to throw myself into this role and understand those soft skills that make an effective board member. But I tried my best in the short time I had. But my best advice is to walk in, appreciate you're a full board member. Don't be shy about asking each of your fellow board members to have lunch or coffee and get to know them on a genuine level. And this is something, I hope makes me an effective lawmaker is I'm not going to convince my colleagues of something just because it's a good idea. I need to know where they're coming from. I need to know their backgrounds, their district, what makes them vote the way they do. It's the same thing with a board. I want to understand why someone chose to do this public service. I want to understand what interests they have and what institutions they care most about and why. And that's going to help inform how I approach them about a certain issue or how I try to convince them of a certain priority. But you can't know that unless you ask people to lunch and you ask people to coffee. I had a list, there's multiple lists, but on my above my desk when I was a student regent of every institution I needed to visit, every university president I needed to take to coffee, every student body president I needed to meet with, every student government association I needed to speak in front of. And just these lists, there were 12 lines long because I had 12 institutions. But as the faster I got through that list of quality meetings, but the more secure I felt in my perspectives and my vote. And Cinthia made a really great point of, we have to work harder to prove ourselves, because I think sometimes a default when we make a decision, we had real tuition challenges when I was a student member of the board. And oftentimes, if I voted against a tuition increase, the default of some of my fellow board members might have been, well, she's just doing that because she's the student. Whereas I was coming from a perspective of, no, the schedule of these tuition increases, it was like 18% for law students. It was, 12% for out-of-state students. There were nuances of that, not to mention the fees. I mean, there were real nuances to how I made my decision. And I felt secure in that decision because I knew my institutions inside and out. So the more work you do, kind of the more secure footing you have on which to make a decision. And if there are naysayers or doubters, you've done your homework, you know what you're talking about, and you've made that vote because you have confidence in your expertise. So that's my best advice.
It's great advice. And you actually hit on an interesting point around just how uniquely relational board rooms tend to be. And I say that that's interesting largely because I think from the lens of looking at this from a gender standpoint, the relational aspects of board work can sometimes be a positive or a negative sort of side of being a board member that interacts with gender. And I wonder if both of you or either of you also see that idea of boardrooms being unique in that aspect of being so relational, and if you have any reflections on how that relational aspect interacts with gender in the boardroom for yourselves or for others, like I said, that you observed, in a way that's different maybe from other experiences that you've had that aren't as relational.
I'll jump in. I'm in politics, so everything I do is relational. The dynamics of the Maryland Senate are very similar to the dynamics of the Board of Regents of the University System of Maryland. It's a lot of understanding each other, building genuine relationships. So when it's time to make difficult decisions, I know where that person is coming from and they know where I'm coming from. So, and then, as a representative of a community, everything I do is relational. So I think it's an incredible experience that is so transferable in my world. And before I was in the Senate, I worked in the nonprofit sector. And I think it's very similar to how nonprofit boards tick as well. So I always say it was a graduate degree in leadership. The year and a half I had on the Board of Regents, but it really elevated my professionalism. Cinthia mentioned consensus building. That's something I think that if you learn that early, that is a skill set and a value I think that never leaves you. And I had the good fortune of learning it on the Board of Regents, and now it's obviously the most important thing I can do in the Maryland Senate. So it was incredibly informative.
Yeah, I mean, at a very macro level, right? Boards are about people. They're about people, and they're about values and mission, and how those people reflect that mission, reflect those values and can execute that mission. And so to the senator's point, I think it's incredibly important to understand your colleagues on a board, what drives them to do the things that they do and why they believe the things that they believe. And so, because, at the end of the day, you're there together under this, singular focus, right, to get a job done. And there are going to be different ways that people think that you can go about doing that job. And so in order for you to be effective at doing your job, right, you need to understand, okay, well, here is a way, a path that I can take to expedite meeting my goals, my objectives, And you also have to be aware of some of the issues, right? And some of the detours and some of the things that you have to be made aware of that might make your path a little bit difficult. And how do you ease some of those, issues that might arise? And I think it's important to understand that at the end of the day, this is all about people, and people that are, at least for most of my board membership, not only just on the Board of Regents, but I'm obviously on Latinas League California or Latina Lawyers Bar Association. They're both volunteer boards, right? And so understanding my colleagues, we're coming together to fulfill this mission guided by values that looks differently for different people, and their motivations are different. And how do we align ourselves to maximize our efforts? So I think relationship building is a real tool and necessary skill to be effective in governance.
I'll add to that. I think the position of being the youngest member of a board really does train you well to approach it. I mentioned confidence before, but also humility is such a great lesson there. And what I would do is when I would meet with a new board member, for the most part, they're really interested in mentoring you. Not every one of them is, but they have a lot of advice and wisdom for you. And so I would always approach it from a space of humility, that I knew my institution really well. I knew my job well, but what was their best advice for me as a new member of the board? Not even as a student member. What advice? I'm the newest member of the board. You've been on the board for 5 years. What do you think? And approaching that from humility. Everybody wants to be asked for advice. I've never met a person who didn't want to share what they thought about something. And that is a skill set and a question that I continue to ask. The day after I was elected to the Senate. Sorry, I live in downtown Annapolis, so sometimes that happens. That was the first question I asked of the Senate president when he called me into the office and asked me what committee I wanted to be on. I just asked him what books he thought I should read to prepare for the job. And that worked out really well. And I got the committee I wanted and the office I wanted, and just approached it from what counsel can you provide me? What mentorship do you have for me? And it served me really well on the board and in my career since.
And that was actually, you almost read my mind, Senator Elfreth. That was going to be my follow-up question, because both of you seem to be talking a lot about consensus building, and Cinthia in particular mentioned sort of this piece about leadership at the beginning that I wanted to touch back on around, what it is like to, take advice, receive mentorship from leaders on the board, and how that interacts with gender on the board. And Senator Elfreth, you've, spoken about this in a way that is really useful, just to approach it, through a humble mindset. And I'm curious, Cinthia, if you have anything to add to that around the piece of leadership, mentorship, approaching it as a woman, and particularly a young woman, who is maybe often taking advice from many people, from the experience of it as a young woman myself. But do you have any reflections on that piece?
I do. I also agree that it's important to take on these roles with a sense of humility, and understanding that you have much to learn. I also think that it's important, especially for women, to go into these conversations understanding that you also have something to give, right? Like, it is not a coincidence. No one's doing you a favor. This is not a surprise. Like, if you are in that position, you're in that position for a reason, right? You're competent, you're present, you're someone that is able to do this job. And so when you go talk to someone, you're not essentially like asking them, hey, teach me how to do my job. It's like, teach me how to do my job better. Like, I have some ideas, you obviously have experience, and you're going into it in an equal partnership, right? And I think that that's key, especially for young women. I always felt like my gender, in particular my gender, but also race, always served as a kind of superpower for me, right? Because I was able to look at things from an intersectional point of view, from a point of view that may not have been mainstream, And so I understood that I had something to add to the conversation, something to add to the solution. And so I always tell folks, be humble, but also, confident, and understanding that you are there to serve a purpose, and it is not a coincidence that you are there. And you bring something, you bring many things. And so as much as you do work in figuring out what your job is, what the scope of work is, what your responsibilities, duties are, also reflect and understand, well, these are the hard skills that I bring to this job on day one. And sit with that and be confident in it, because that will only add to your skill set as a competent, confident leader.
Cinthia, I really love what you just said. And Julie and I talked about this before, imposter syndrome that I think a lot of women or young people of color experience when you find yourself in these rooms. But what I love about when Cinthia said is be confident that you earned that seat. It might be an odd feeling to be in that room at 20 years old, but there was a process that you succeeded in and had to prove yourself. In our case, we had 3 or 4 different interviews with that were pretty hard, but we earned that seat. We had a great resume. We brought something to the table, and so I never had imposter syndrome in that boardroom. There were sometimes, and I still have this, like sometimes I wake up and I'm like, holy shit, I'm in the Maryland Senate and I'm 32, like that's weird. But I also recognize that I had to went through a really tough interview process for that board. I spent my whole undergrad career, working towards that goal. I earned that seat. The same thing in the Senate race. I had a tough campaign and I earned my seat in each room I found myself in. And so I try to express to young women as often as I can, you should not experience imposter syndrome when you have confidence that you worked to get there and that you earned your seat at that table.
Both really empowering notes. And I realize that they allude to both of your experiences in public office, public service, positions of leadership on the state and national level, on issues that serve people across your communities. And I'm sure that, as you have mentioned through this conversation, a lot of the lessons that you have taken from your student regent positions, and in particular from this conversation, experiences around gender in the boardroom have, informed the way that you approach your current roles. And if there's anything that you would like to add about that for a lot of, folks who might be interested in how the skills from these sorts of positions can be applicable later on, in roles of service or otherwise. I know both of you serve sort of on multiple boards and positions of leadership. So Cinthia, if you have any reflections on that, I'd love to start off with you.
Yeah, serving as a student regent for the UC prepared me for my service on many boards thereafter. From something as technical as understanding, if you're serving on a state board, you're going to have to disclose certain economic interests, right? Ethics regulations, public meeting guidelines, right? Like we have a Bagley-Keene, right? That you have to provide certain notice for when your body comes together. And so those are very technical things that I learned, but also kind of more of those soft skills where, figuring out that a lot of the times the meeting happens before the meeting, right? So if you are going to be at a meeting, make sure that you do all of the work, right? Align your ducks in a row prior to that meeting, because if you're trying to do it on meeting day, it is not going to go places, And so it also helped me kind of finesse and understand how to effectively use my voice. And so figuring out, when, where, and with whom to bring up certain things was super important. And kind of really understand the weight of my voice and my decision making. So I'd say, it was a wonderful experience. I also had I served as student body president prior to being on the board of regents. So I had learned a little bit of that skill set. I think when I got onto the board, I was fairly prepared for the expectations of me. But it took it to another level. So I would say, use it as a building block, right? Like every opportunity that you get, you're going to get better and better and better at service, at governance. But yeah, those were kind of things that I took from the experience.
I think two things in addition to the soft skills that we've been talking about this whole time, which again, I cannot overstate how important Cynthia's point about the decisions are often made before the meeting. And so how to strategize and how to get what you want or convince people of something, you can't do that in the meeting. Two things that really impacted me, I was so fortunate at the age of 20 to feel this, but the public service component of what you are doing, that you have this tremendous opportunity to impact something that is so much larger than yourself as an individual. And you're surrounded by these people who are volunteering their time to do the same. And so just that lifelong sense of public service was so influential at a young age, and not something I came from. I didn't come from a kind of family that understood or valued that. So getting that at the age of 20 was huge. And then also having a better understanding of how change happens. We had an incident, completely unpredictable, because really, if you're going to choose to jump into a board, I would say half of your work you're going to undertake is something that just kind of is a grass fire that pops up that you have to handle, not something you predicted or thought you'd spend your time doing. We had an incident in 2009 where a state senator who is now in Congress decided to use the budget as a vehicle. There was a pornographic film that was shown at one of our college campuses. It was reported in the paper. The state senator stood on the Senate floor and talked about how horrible it was that the public university was screening that. It was a student group, right? But he actually got into the budget, which is in Maryland, it's binding budget language, that the university system would have to come up with some type of policy in regards to free speech. So that suddenly became my year on the Board of Regents, is how to mitigate and how to work through this issue. So the system hired a constitutional law attorney, and we're kind of working through this process. But in the meantime, I had all these student groups who were justifiably really upset that the system could be possibly undertaking a once in the nation, stance on limiting free speech on college campuses. And I had a lot of students want me to be, outside with a bullhorn at these rallies, really outspoken and be more aggressive. I think they wanted me to be than I knew my role as a board member would allow. So I really started to understand it's so important to have those students or a piece of a movement, being loud, having rallies, writing op-eds, calling the news, drumming up support for or against an issue. But it was equally important that I was in that boardroom, being a full professional, equal member of the board, negotiating on their behalf, but not lighting my hair on fire. And for those things to work, they have to work in conjunction. And I had to be in constant contact with the students at the time. And we were able to shift the thinking and say like, hey, maybe we shouldn't, have a first in the nation, probably unconstitutional perspective on free speech on college campuses. But I do try to talk, when I talk to student regents, you don't get to be, you don't have the luxury of necessarily being a regular person who gets to attend a rally all the time or be the loudest person in the room, because your job is to be that negotiator in the boardroom for the people that you represent, and vice versa, right? Your job is to be a conduit between the two, not just you in the boardroom representing students, but you with the students representing the board, and understanding that dynamic and working together in a movement to create change. That's a lesson I learned really, really early that would never have predicted I would get the chance to work on, except for this budget language. So
that is really interesting. And I think it speaks to the ever difficult role of the student trustee in particular that we've spoken to many panelists about before in the past, that just it's a uniquely difficult position in the sense that you are alongside your peers constantly, and, you know, in a way feel like you have to, you know, are accountable to them, have to answer to them, and then at the same time are a negotiator on this board. But that's a whole different conversation for another time, because we have two amazing questions in the chat now. And Jasmine, I wonder if you want to read them off.
Yeah, I think we can definitely start with Danielle's question. So Danielle is one of the organizers of Harvard Forward, sharing that they recruited and supported a slate of 3 young women to run for our board. The question for the panelists is, how do you think it might have affected your experience to serve alongside multiple other young women?
I'll take a stab at that. So I work alongside a fierce group of Latinas in my role as Latina Lawyers Bar Association Vice President and Treasurer for Latinas League California. And I'm gonna tell you, those boards, they're volunteer boards, and we get it done. Like, we raise the money, we give the scholarships out, we plan the events, we get it done, and we get it done effective, efficient, just all-star work. And I've served on a number of boards, and I will say that there is a difference serving alongside women. And so from that experience that I know to be true, I think, you know, had I worked, you know, more hand in hand, and I did have the luxury of having my my second year. So my year as student regent, I did have a student regent designate who was a young woman, and it's, you know, if we were just a cohort of us, I think it would have just been that much more efficient and effective. I don't know how else to say it. I think, you know, there's a collaborative spirit. There's, you know, less ego involved, generally speaking, right? And it's really about the mission and the work at hand, rather than, you know, sometimes, you know, the glory of. I always think that that's weird. I'm like, there really isn't much glory in this, but but it's definitely about, you know, subscribing to the mission and pushing that forward. So I think, based on my lived experience on these boards, I think it would have been a riot. It would have been great. Yeah.
I can't imagine how much better it would have been. But I now serve, so I have 2 delegates in my district, and they're both women. So we're the first all-female delegation in the history of Maryland, which is pretty great. And they, I couldn't ask for better teammates in terms of how hard they work and how passionate they are about the service that they undertook. When I was on the board, what I really relied on and cannot advise highly enough is working and meeting with and leaning on other young people and other students who are on similar boards. I came into the Board of Regents kind of right when this tiny little movement was starting with some other student regents and trustees across the country. So I actually went out to the UC system, UCLA, for our first conference, and there were folks from Texas and Wisconsin and obviously California and a couple of other states. There were maybe like 12 of us that first year. But we quickly realized, and this was, you know, only a couple years removed from the recession, so we were really having to make difficult decisions in higher ed at that time, in public higher ed. And we quickly realized that we're from all these different states and all these different situations, but so much of our roles and our responsibilities and the challenges we face were the same. And so leaning on each other and calling each other and, hey, how did you work through this vote? Or, you know, I was having a really rough day. What do you think I should do? That was so helpful, because it's a very isolating role. Because a lot of your colleagues, if you're a student member, a lot of your friends are like dealing with their senior year and having fun and being 21, and you're, you know, traveling the state, going to these receptions, working every single day and taking classes. So and making, you know, really tough decisions for a young age. So it's a very isolating experience, and leaning on each other is very helpful. So we continued that tradition for a couple of years afterwards. Arizona was really involved. They eventually came to Baltimore. But having that coalition, that's actually how I met Cynthia's predecessors, from that work. And, you know, not shocking at all those people are doing incredibly cool, important things today. Because if you're a go-getter at 21, you're going to continue to go get it later in life. But relying on each other and leaning on each other and understanding that your separate experiences are, you're going to have mutual challenges and opportunities to learn from each other.
Great, thank you so much for both, sharing your perspectives in response to that question. It's great to hear that you didn't really have to hypothesize about it, but that, later on in your careers, you actually had that direct experience. We have a few minutes left, and I do want to get to Nora's question in the chat. She's asking, how do you grapple with differences in leadership styles, particularly on male-dominated boards? I'm at Penn State, and one of the issues often discussed is Joe Paterno's legacy. The woman I've talked to view it significantly differently, as Joe Paterno's legacy was involved in the Sandusky scandal, which involved the sexual abuse of dozens of children. In thinking about this, men and women are socialized so differently and fill leadership roles differently. I found that women are socialized to be more empathetic and perhaps be perceived as too activists in situations like these. Have you had to communicate across those differences, and do you have any tips on how to do so?
Well, Nora, when that whole situation was happening and I was far removed from my board, I actually reached out to the student member, one of your predecessors who was on the board, and I cannot imagine how difficult that time was for him. I'm blanking on his name, but those are really tough issues to deal with. In that case, I've always found asking questions is really helpful. So if someone approaches you and accuses you of being too empathetic, I would just turn around and it's number one, good, because it's you actually trying to understand their perspective. But number two, it puts them in the awkward seat of having to justify why they feel like, the sexual abuse of children is justified in any possible way. So just flipping the script and asking them genuinely why they feel this way. And it's gonna turn them on their heads. Other tips for dealing with men: run faster than they do. I've always and work harder than they do, and I've always found that works too. I'm gonna have to think about this, but I would definitely advise asking them and making them justify why they feel a certain way about this issue.
Yeah, I think this is actually why it's so important for women to step into these roles and help one another achieve and be successful in these positions, because unfortunately, as previously mentioned, we do live in a patriarchal society that subscribes to certain traits, right, that have been normalized as effective, efficient leadership traits. And so it's not surprising that someone that doesn't fit that mold, in this case, I'll use the example of being empathetic, right, would be almost penalized for it, right? Where it's like, there isn't one singular mode of leadership. It's just unfortunately that we've been socialized to think that there is. And so the more women step into leadership positions, the more folks that are non-binary, the folks that are, trans identified, folks that are of different backgrounds, not just gender identities, race, socioeconomic backgrounds, step into these roles and kind of defy what traditional standards as effective leadership looks like, the more inclusive of a society we're going to be able to accomplish or achieve. And so I guess I'll leave it at that and address it kind of like in a big picture way. Just generally, those are my thoughts.
And that kind of big picture statement is a great place to end off our conversation, because we're at the hour and I want to be respectful of all of you all's time. So I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to both of our amazing panelists. I've loved, watching you connect over mutual friends and colleagues. And also thank you to our audience members for your really insightful questions that, I think brought up a lot of conversations that I hope that will continue in the future. Thank you also to Jasmine, again, another educational programs team member that makes sure that these events run smoothly. Could not be more thankful. So With that, I will say thanks again. And if our panelists want to leave us off with any last words, I'll let you have the floor.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I love reflecting back on that time. I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't had that opportunity and people who believed in me and in relationships from my time on the board. I'll just say, I'll say 3 quick things. I'm sorry. Number 1, I'm always here. I try to meet with the student member of the University System of Maryland's board every year to be of help to them, but I'm here for anybody if they ever need advice on board membership. I wrote my senior honors thesis that was published into a book on this very topic and interviewed student regents from across the country and condensed all of their advice into that book, which is available online. So please refer to that as well if that can be helpful. And third, something I was told when I was on the board, and I really believe in it, no one gets anywhere on their own. And a lot of people helped the board members I served with get where they are. They helped me get where I am. And their only ask of me ever was that I would do the same for other young people when I had the opportunity. And that's a commitment I make and a promise I make all of my interns and my students and every young person I work with. I will do anything to be of help to them, but they have to turn that around when they have that same opportunity. So I think that's just an essential lesson from my board time that I really take to heart.
Awesome. Just similarly, thank you so much for having me. One thing I'll leave folks with is something that's helped me kind of step into my leadership. And it's really be your authentic self. No board, no position, nothing is worth you changing who you are in order to get there. And being your authentic self actually is a benefit to those institutions. Like I said, we need to have more people step into these roles, being their authentic self. And so it's another superpower of mine, and I'll just share it with you all.
It's an amazing superpower, and certainly something that I think has really important implications for gender and being able to bring your full and authentic self into the boardroom. So thank you, Cinthia, and thank you, Senator Elfreth. With that, I will wish you both and all of our audience members and Jasmine a great rest of your Thursdays. And if you need to keep in touch with the boarding school, you can find our website at theboardingschool.org or email me directly at julia@theboardingschool.org. So thank you all. Have a great night.